In March of 1947, a relatively unpopular president walked into Congress with a speech almost no one expected to matter. 18 months after the war ended, America wanted to sleep. But Truman had just been handed a cable that changed everything. And what he said next committed the United States to a game it had never officially agreed to play. A game with no board, no clock, no fixed rules, and no exit. In March of 1947, a relatively unpopular president walked into a joint session of Congress with a speech that almost no one expected to matter. 18 months earlier, the war was over. The boys were home. America wanted to sleep. But Harry Truman had just been handed a cable that changed everything. And what he said next, in under 18 minutes, committed the United States to a game it had never officially agreed to play. A game with no board, no clock, no fixed rules, and no exit.
To understand why the Truman Doctrine mattered, you have to understand what the strategic board looked like before America made its move. World War II ended with two players left standing. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought the same enemy, but they were never truly on the same side. They were two powers who had cornered a common threat together, and the moment that threat was gone, they were staring directly at each other across a shattered continent. Europe in 1946 was not a victory. It was a vacuum. Entire economies had collapsed. Governments had been dissolved, occupied, or burned to the ground. And into that vacuum, two very different visions of the future were rushing to fill the space. The Soviets moved fast. Soviet-backed governments were being installed across Eastern Europe. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. One by one, countries that had been promised free elections were becoming Soviet satellites. This is classic positional play. Not capturing pieces dramatically, but quietly occupying squares that restrict your opponent's future movement. Stalin didn't need to invade Western Europe with tanks. He just needed to make sure that when the dust settled, every neighboring square was occupied by someone who answered to Moscow. And here is the part most Americans didn't see in real time. The United States had just demobilized. 12 million men had come home. Defense budgets were being slashed. Congress wanted normalcy. The isolationist instinct, the one that had kept America out of European wars for most of its history, was surging back hard. America had won the war. The assumption was, now we go home. That assumption was about to cost them the opening. On February 21st, 1947, the British Embassy delivered two diplomatic notes to the U.S. State Department. The message was simple and devastating. Britain was broke. Completely, structurally, generationally broke. The empire that had held the Mediterranean line, that had propped up Greece and Turkey against Soviet pressure, could no longer afford to do it. In 6 weeks, British financial support to both countries would end. This was not a gradual shift. This was a tempo collapse. In chess, when a player runs out of useful moves and hands the initiative to the opponent, the game almost always tips. Britain had just run out of moves and handed the initiative to whoever acted next. Greece was already in civil war. Communist guerrillas, backed by Yugoslavia and indirectly supplied through Soviet-aligned networks, were pushing hard against a fragile Greek government. Turkey was facing Soviet pressure to surrender naval access to the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the critical waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. If the Soviets got that, their navy was no longer landlocked. Their strategic reach expanded into waters that had been Western-dominated for a century. Dean Acheson, Truman's Undersecretary of State, laid it out in a White House meeting that stunned the room. He said that if Greece fell to communism, like apples in a barrel infected by one rotten apple, the infection would spread to Iran and all to the east, to Africa, to Italy, to France. The domino logic, before anyone had given it that name. Truman heard it.
And he made a decision that most presidents, especially one as politically weakened as he was at that moment, would never have made. He decided to play.
March 12, 1947. Truman did not come to Congress to ask for money for Greece and Turkey. That would have been too small, too specific, too easy to reject as another European entanglement that had nothing to do with American lives. He came to reframe the entire game. The speech was written carefully, almost surgically, to accomplish one specific thing: turn a regional crisis into a universal American commitment. And the key line is worth reading slowly because every word in it is deliberate. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Not Greece, not Turkey. Free peoples, anywhere, everywhere, resisting subjugation from anyone. This wasn't a policy request. This was a pledge, an open-ended, globally applicable commitment made in public before Congress on the record that America would stand with any free nation facing communist subversion. In strategic terms, Truman had just played a bold gambit opening. He sacrificed flexibility, the ability to say, "This doesn't involve us," in exchange for something far more powerful: initiative. From this moment forward, the United States was no longer reactive. It had declared a posture. The Soviets now had to calculate every move on the board, knowing that American support could materialize anywhere a free nation was threatened. But gambits always cut both ways. A gambit accepted gives your opponent real material, and the cost of this opening wouldn't become fully visible for years.
Congress was not immediately sold. The Republicans had won back the House and Senate in 1946 on a platform of cutting spending and staying out of foreign entanglements. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, the most powerful Republican voice on foreign policy at the time, told Truman directly, "If you want the money, you'll have to scare hell out of the American people." So that is exactly what the Truman administration did. The public messaging around the doctrine stripped the Greek Civil War of its complexity. It was not presented as a deeply rooted internal conflict with historical, ethnic, and political dimensions that went back decades. It was presented as a clean binary: democracy under siege by communist aggression. The nuance was removed, the stakes were maximized, and the framing worked. Congress approved $400 million for Greece and Turkey. The immediate crisis was managed. Greece's civil war ended with the communist side defeated by 1949. Turkey remained in the Western orbit and would eventually become a NATO member. On the surface, the gambit paid off immediately. But here is the hidden cost of the opening that almost no one talks about. To sell the doctrine, they simplified the entire world into two sides. And once you've told the American public that the world is binary, free versus communist, democracy versus tyranny, you've locked yourself into a framework where every future crisis must be interpreted through that same lens. You've committed to seeing the board only one way. That's not a strategic advantage. That's a cognitive trap. And it would take decades for the full weight of it to land.
The Truman Doctrine didn't stay in Greece and Turkey. That was never really the plan. Almost simultaneously, diplomat George Kennan, one of the most rigorous strategic minds America produced in the 20th century, was writing what would become the intellectual backbone of American Cold War strategy. His famous long telegram from Moscow, and then the anonymous article published in Foreign Affairs under the signature X, laid out a concept that would define the next 4 decades of American foreign policy: containment. The idea was fundamentally positional. You don't have to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. You don't have to roll back communism everywhere it already exists. You simply prevent it from spreading further. Hold every square you currently occupy. Build barriers, economic, military, political, around the perimeter of the free world. And wait. Kennan believed the Soviet system carried within it the seeds of its own eventual collapse. The game wasn't about checkmate by force, it was about endurance. Deny the opponent room to expand. Don't overextend your own position. Don't blunder into an unnecessary confrontation. Outlast. This is textbook positional thinking. Patience, structure, and denying the opponent activity rather than hunting for the decisive blow. The Truman Doctrine was the first piece moved in that strategy. Greece and Turkey weren't just two countries, they were the southeastern anchor of the board. And once Truman committed to defending that corner, the logic demanded defending the next square, and the next. The Marshall Plan, announced just 3 months after the doctrine, applied the same logic economically. Rebuild Western Europe, make it prosperous enough to resist communist political parties winning elections through democratic means. If you can't hold a square with soldiers, hold it with reconstruction funds and economic dependency on the Western system. NATO, signed in 1949, was the military formalization of the same principle. Collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. The board is now defined. These squares belong to the West. Cross this line and the entire alliance responds. 3 moves: Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, NATO. In less than 3 years, America had played an opening sequence that restructured the entire geopolitical board. But here is what most accounts skip over entirely. The man whose intellectual framework made containment possible became horrified by what the doctrine had unleashed.
George Kennan, the mind behind containment, believed the Truman Doctrine was a mistake, not the goal, the framing. Kennan's version of containment was selective, surgical. He wanted to defend specific, genuinely vital centers of industrial and military power: Western Europe, Japan, a few critical choke points. He believed the United States had to choose its commitments carefully, based on actual strategic value, not ideological reflex. Every move had to be measured against what was truly at stake. What Truman's speech did instead was militarize the doctrine and universalize it. The language, free peoples, resisting subjugation, anywhere, had no geography, no hierarchy, no distinction between a square worth dying for and one that was strategically irrelevant. To Kennan, this was positional overextension. You cannot hold every square on a board that large. The moment you commit to defending every free nation everywhere from any communist threat, you've given your opponent infinite places to probe. All they have to do is find the square you're least able to defend, apply pressure there, and watch you either overcommit resources or publicly abandon the principle you just declared. Kennan saw what was coming. He spent years trying to correct the interpretation. He argued loudly that containment was meant to be political and economic, not military. That it required discrimination. Not every communist movement was a Soviet-directed threat. That America would exhaust itself if it tried to police every corner of the globe. Nobody in power was listening. Because the Truman Doctrine had already been spoken in public, before Congress, before the world. You cannot unsay a gambit once the piece has moved. The commitment existed. It was on the record. And every future president would inherit the board exactly as Truman left it, with an open-ended promise that now had to be honored. Korea, 1950. 54,000 American dead. Vietnam, 1965. 58,000 American dead. Iran, a covert operation in 1953 that overthrew a democratically elected government.
Here is a question worth sitting with. How did the Soviets actually interpret the Truman Doctrine? From Moscow's perspective, the picture looked completely different. The Soviet Union had just lost approximately 27 million people in World War II. Their western borders had been invaded twice in 30 years. Every major Soviet strategic calculation was filtered through a single obsession: never again allow an enemy to approach from the west unimpeded. The satellite states in Eastern Europe weren't just ideological trophies to Stalin. They were buffer squares, strategic depth. The same logic that makes any chess player value space and defensive barriers. Stalin wasn't plotting global domination in 1947 in the way Western propaganda framed it. He was building a wall, piece by piece, as close to potential threats as geography would allow.
When the Truman Doctrine was announced, Soviet leadership did not see a defensive American commitment to protecting small democracies. They saw a declaration of American intent to project power into regions that bordered the Soviet sphere. They saw pieces moving toward them. This is the tragedy embedded at the heart of the entire Cold War opening. Two players looking at the same board, each convinced the other was the aggressor. Each move one side made to feel more secure made the other side feel less secure. Each defensive measure was interpreted across the table as an offensive threat. Strategists call this the security dilemma, and once you're inside it, almost every rational move makes the conflict worse, even the ones taken in genuine fear. The Truman Doctrine didn't create the Cold War. The confrontation was already forming before the speech, but the doctrine formalized it, made it official, drew the line in ink instead of pencil. And once the line was drawn in ink, both sides had to defend it with everything they had.
Let's be direct about something that gets glossed over in most tellings. Truman was not a grand strategist in the mold of a Churchill or a Bismarck. He was a former haberdasher from Missouri who had been kept in the dark about the Manhattan Project until the moment he became president. He served as vice president for 82 days before FDR died and handed him the most complicated geopolitical inheritance in American history. He had no foreign policy experience at the scale the moment demanded. His approval ratings were in the basement. His own party had doubts about him. The press treated him as a caretaker, not a leader. And yet, the decision he made in March 1947 was arguably correct for the crisis directly in front of him. Greece was genuinely at risk. Turkey's location genuinely mattered. British withdrawal genuinely created a vacuum that someone had to fill or concede. The alternatives? Letting communist forces consolidate in Greece, allowing Soviet access to the Turkish Straits, signaling that America was withdrawing from European affairs permanently, each carried serious downstream consequences that would have made the board significantly worse. The Truman Doctrine, for all its overreach in language, achieved its immediate objectives. It saved the immediate crisis. It unlocked the political will in Congress to fund the Marshall Plan. It persuaded Western Europe that America would stay, and that assurance mattered enormously. Large communist parties in France and Italy were competitive in the late 1940s. The American commitment made the Western alternative credible in ways it might not have been without the signal Truman sent. The opening worked. The question was always what the full price of playing it would eventually turn out to be. The Truman Doctrine committed America to a 44-year game. And in that game, the costs were real and enormous. Korea ended in a stalemate that technically remains unresolved to this day. Vietnam tore the country apart socially, politically, and morally, and ended in strategic defeat, not because the military failed in any conventional sense, but because the universal logic of the Truman Doctrine couldn't distinguish between a vital national interest and a symbolic one. Vietnam wasn't Greece. The guerrilla conflict there had deep nationalist roots that existed independently of Moscow's direction. But the public commitment made in 1947 had created institutional and political pressure to respond as if every falling domino was equally catastrophic. The covert operations in Iran and Guatemala, both framed in the language of communist containment, destabilized governments and generated grievances whose consequences are still unfolding decades later. In Iran's case, the blowback from the 1953 coup helped produce the 1979 revolution and the adversarial relationship that shapes Middle East policy to this day. This is the endgame Truman could not see from 1947. When you make a universal commitment, you inherit every application of it. You cannot selectively honor a pledge you made in absolute terms before the entire world. And yet, and this may be the most important single sentence in this entire story,
the Truman Doctrine is usually taught as a chapter in a textbook, a policy response to a regional crisis, a historical moment with a clean beginning and a clean end. But what it actually was is an opening move in a strategic framework that shaped every consequential American foreign policy decision
for 2 full generations. Every alliance, every intervention, every covert operation, every arms deal, every war fought under the banner of stopping the spread of communism. They all trace back, in some logical chain, to the language one man from Missouri spoke to a skeptical Congress on a Tuesday morning in March of 1947. The lesson is not that Truman was right, or that he was wrong. The lesson is that opening moves carry consequences their players cannot fully see at the moment of commitment. When you establish a principle in public, you've moved the piece. The board changes. Your opponent adapts. Future players inherit a position they didn't create and must make the best of it regardless. The deepest strategic insight from the entire Cold War is this: the player who controls the framing of the game controls the game itself. Truman didn't just commit resources to 2 small countries on the edge of Europe. He defined what the entire contest was about. He named the enemy. He named the stakes. He named America's role in the world. And once the framing is set, every move by both sides happens inside that frame. The Cold War wasn't just a conflict between 2 superpowers competing for territory and influence. It was a 44-year argument about whose vision of the world was correct. America won that argument, not because every move was right, not because the costs weren't real, but because the opening was sound enough, the structure held long enough, and in the endgame, the logic of freedom, however imperfectly applied, outlasted the logic of control. Harry Truman put the first piece on the board on March 12, 1947. The game played out exactly the way the best openings do. Slowly, painfully, with consequences nobody fully predicted. But it won.